5 and then jump into chapter 6 this morning. As we just got done looking at this event, kind of two miracles going on at once, at least the two stories of them going on at once, where you have Jairus, the synagogue leader, who has come to Jesus and has begged Jesus to come and to heal his daughter because she is at death's door. And right in the middle of this, as Jesus is trying to push through the crowd, another woman has touched the hem of his garment. And she was healed of her ailment when she touched the hem of his garment. And so we kind of concluded right there at that point, because we're shifting now our focus back over to Jairus, the synagogue leader. And it was such almost a panic that he comes to Jesus. I need you to come now. And Jesus is delayed. He stopped and he dealt with this woman for a little while. And so we kind of talked about that, just imagining what's going through his mind right now. Then we have the men come from the house of Jairus and say, you don't need to bother the rabbi anymore. Your daughter's already dead. And so we see all of these things beginning to take place. Jesus, well, let's look here in verse 37. Chapter 5, verse 37. Well, hold on real quick. 35 and 36. We looked at that last week. He comes to the house, and the people are there. Jesus says in verse 36, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." So now in verse 37, he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. Here we see the very first time that Jesus singles out Peter and James and John. This isn't going to be the last time. We'll see them being singled out a couple more times. Those that seem to have been more of the leaders within the apostles, more of the personalities of being leaders, possibly. We know that John is described as the disciple that Jesus loved, showing there was a close relation, maybe closer relationship there. As a human being, Jesus was just like you and me. We need to have that someone, and you, for those that are married, you have that someone that is your spouse. But even then, ladies usually have that someone. It's a friend, that girlfriend of hers that she knows that she can just talk to, that she can pour her heart out to. Guys have that guy that we don't exactly necessarily pour our heart out exactly in the same way. But it's that guy that you know you can go to, that you're a little bit closer to. You know you can trust. He's not going to judge you in any way. He might challenge you, but it's just that guy that you know that you have in your life. And we all need that type of a friendship, Jesus included. And so we see these three men that seem to be a little bit closer to Jesus in many of the things that he does. But looking at this, it could also be a sense, I hadn't thought about this until I was doing this study through Mark, that in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, Deuteronomy 19, verse 5, under the old law, and I make mention in my text of those two verses, right here next to verse 37, because under the old law, in order for it to be a credible witness account, how many witnesses did you have to have? 2 or 3. And when we see Peter, James, and John pulled out of the rest of the apostles by themselves, it is almost always because there is some significant event that's about to take place. And this is going to be something later when Peter writes his letters in 1st and 2nd Peter. There's several times that Peter makes reference to the fact that I witnessed this. And so, and it wasn't just Peter. He's able to say there were at least 2 or 3 of us there that witnessed it. And so I had never really thought about that before, that now by 2 or 3 witnesses, Jesus uses these men, his apostles, to go along with him when there's very significant events about to take place. And so as they enter the house, it was a loud and a very active scene. Here they walk in, it says there was weeping, loud weeping and wailing. Now we can understand that. His daughter has just died. We understand. Eastern cultures, there's a lot more of a weeping and wailing that you see on the outside. Western culture, we bottle that up a little more. And I don't know that that's a real healthy thing to do, but we internalize that more for some reason. And there is obviously still mourning on the outside, but in the Eastern cultures, it is loud. It's masses of people that are called in. What we've learned is that in the Jewish culture, the Jewish traditions gave a whole list of things that were required that must be done to properly mourn a death. Nothing you'll find in the law of Moses, but something that you find that the Jews, the over time, the traditionally, and basically they've made those some of their laws, some of their if you don't do this right, you're doing it wrong. And just like we've seen the Pharisees dealing with several things with Jesus already. And the way that they mourned was one of those things. And so what became a practice was hiring professional mourners. And so there are people that you could hire, and they would come into your home, and they would do all the mourning the way that it was supposed to be done, so that you could say that it was done properly, but you didn't have to do it yourself. It was still getting done. And so it just really shows the way that the Jews had twisted things, and when they apply things that God does not apply, how man then tries to find the loophole to get out of that. And so it had become a practice to hire mourners to come in, and they would be loud, and they would cry real tears, and they would make it a big deal. And so we have this event that's taking place with all of these people going on. As a matter of fact, some of the things that mourning the Jews required, it would include beating on their breasts and tearing out their hair, tearing their clothes. And the thing was, according to their traditional law, the clothes that were torn during mourning, after 30 days, you could repair that garment. If you did it after 29 days, you broke the law. They would have considered that sin. And again, nothing in Scripture in the old law that points to that. It's total tradition. Many times they'd bring in flute players that were hired to add to kind of a mournful sound in the home. The mourners could not wear shoes during the time of mourning. You could read from the books of Job and Jeremiah and Lamentation, but you were not allowed to read from the books of the law. You couldn't read Genesis through Deuteronomy. That was part of what they said was required. All water was removed from the house, and 3 houses on either side, because it was believed that the angel of death killed with a sword that was dipped in water. So leading up to the death of a person, they would start removing all the water, because it was an idea, I have no idea where this came from, that the angel of death, when he actually took the life of someone, would dip his sword in water first. And so if we can remove the water from the house and 3 houses on either side of us, then maybe that'll prolong the life of the person. And again, just traditional skepticism, what's the word? Superstition that they practiced. So all of these practices, they really just reflect the hypocrisy of the Jewish traditions. And so the mourners would be hired to make sure that all of this was done again, so family members didn't have to do it. And so that's the scene that they walk into. Well, and being that he is a synagogue official, higher status, he's going to probably have even more people that are involved in doing this. So it is quite the scene. So verse 39 says, "And entering in, he said to them, 'Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep.' And they began laughing at him. But putting them all out," well, let's stop there first. How do you go from weeping and wailing and mourning to laughing? How does that happen? It's because they were hired. That's what they did. This was a profession. And so if this was real authentic mourning, you don't go from mourning and weeping and wailing to all of a sudden turn around and laughing at somebody because of something they said. Now, if somebody came into my house and said something about a loved one who has just passed away and that I realize is ridiculous, the last thing I'm going to do is laugh. I might get upset. I might get mad. I might tell them to leave. But laughing is not the response that we would normally have. And that, again, it just shows what's happening here and the type of people that are involved in what's going on here. What's that? It's possible. Sure. Okay. Uh-huh. Sure. And I think this is a good place for us to see the difference between the way that we look at life and death and the way that God looks at life and death. We look at life and we look at death as the end. And God, it's just a continuation. It's just another chapter. And I think if we develop more of that type of a perspective on life and death, it will help us in our faith, in dealing with situations in this life, in so many better ways. And like I say, the grief and the loss and all that and the way that it can affect people, being around a lot of death and a lot of funerals and a lot of people who are mourning, there is a completely different feel when you're around Christians than when you're around non-Christians. It is completely different. And to walk into a Christian's home when there is a death and to actually, I have seen more laughter around a scene like that with Christians where family are together and they're talking and they're laughing and they're about the life of that person and things like that because they understand and know this isn't the end. This is just the next step. And actually, it's the victory of it all. And so when Jesus looks at something like this as when he says she's just asleep, he almost put it in the sense of her body just fell asleep. How does the Apostle Paul, he uses that phrase in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, doesn't he? When he talks about those that have fallen asleep in Christ. He's talking about those who have physically died, but it's almost in that context of 1 Thessalonians 4, it's in a context of the resurrection. And so it's almost that idea of, okay, the body has fallen asleep. It's just asleep. It's waiting for the day that when it is going to be revived and resurrected again. And so it's because of the way that Paul uses it in 1 Thessalonians, we kind of get a little bit more of that picture and that idea of maybe what Jesus is even saying here. And so There are other times that in John 11, when Lazarus dies, Jesus uses the idea that he has fallen asleep there too. But what is the context? Resurrection. He's about to raise him from the dead. So it's the same, the consistency of the context in each of those. And so to Jesus, I think what Steve said was right. He understands that when the spirit leaves the body, it's not dead. The spirit's not dead, obviously, but the body itself, it just seems as though it's temporarily sleeping. It's waiting for a day when it's going to be raised. And so the idea of sleep as well is it's a comforting picture. I like that way of thinking about death. And it's different. There are different cultures. The Anglo-Saxons, when they buried their dead in graveyards, a place where holes are graven in the ground and you place a dead body. The Greeks use a different word. They use the word cemetery. Comes from the word in the Greek, it's koimeterion. And it's a word that literally means a place to lie down and sleep. And so even in different cultures, this idea of we're just laying them down to sleep. And if you've been in that room, many of you have more than once, where someone physically falls asleep permanently. And it's at that moment that you can understand that picture of, I can remember as a small child, very first funeral I ever attended, and I walked up, my mom and dad took me up to view the casket. That's the first thought that was in my head was, well, why don't they wake up? They just look like they're sleeping. And to have that image when you're in that time of your life with someone else in your life, just to have that thought of it's only sleep, and to know that there is more that's yet to come. And so, yep. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, they probably connect something like this with it. It almost always has to do, when I've talked to people about that, has to do with if I'm going to be resurrected into my body, then if my body is destroyed, then what am I going to be resurrected into? The issue, and I've done a lesson on that. I don't know if I've preached it here or not. I may have. But I know in the past, I did a lesson on cremation, biblical view of it. And when you actually look at kind of some of the facts, if you dig up a body that's in a grave, that's probably not the body you want to be resurrected into anyway. What about back before they preserved bodies with what's that? Well, mummification, or what do we call it today? Embalming, and bodies completely decayed. They naturally all decayed. Is that much different than if it's sped up with fire? That body that is no longer, it's now seeped into the soil and into the water table, and plants and animals and everything else are now taking advantage of your death and what you left behind. If God has the power to raise your body when it's decayed, pretty sure he'd have the power to raise your body if it has been incinerated. What about somebody who dies because of fire? Are they not going to be able to be resurrected? There's just a lot of common sense things, I think, that come into it as well. But I do think what you're asking, that this is the type of thing that people will point to when they... What's that? Yeah, and that could be too. Right. Right. It could be. It could be. I've not heard that from somebody, and I've talked to several about this. I almost always get the question of, is God going to be able to put my body back together if it's if it's burned. And that's usually where the questions come from. I think but yeah, if he put it all together from nothing in the beginning, I'm pretty sure he can bring it all back together. However, he's going to do that in the end, so I'm not too concerned about it. But good questions, very good questions. Look at verse 41. He says, taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. Now with these three apostles and then other witnesses that were family members in the room, Jesus simply reaches down and takes the little girl by the hand, and with these two words, Talitha cum. This phrase, Talitha cum, is Aramaic. Even though the common language of the people is Koine Greek, the Jews, they began to use the Aramaic language starting back when they were in Babylonian captivity. And so at that time, they adopted the Aramaic as well. And even in the first century, even though Koine Greek was the common language amongst most people in the Roman Empire, Aramaic still remained what some call the house language, the language of the home in Jewish families, especially in the north in Galilee. And so what Jesus is doing is he's using a language this is what they would many times speak to each other within their home. In the first century, most people probably were able to speak 3 or 4 or more languages because of the different peoples that were all around them. And so Aramaic was just one. We see Jesus use Aramaic several times during his life. And so this is just one. He's speaking to them a language that was fitting for that setting, or to her, fitting for that setting in the home. That's the way they would have talked to each other. And so just by simply saying, little girl, I say to you, get up. And so with the spoken word, Jesus raises the dead. His hand was there just to aid her as she rose. And Mark, again, he uses the word, our word euthus, the word immediately, to show the instant result of Jesus' miracle. Now, she's been sick for a while, and we don't know what state her body has deteriorated into. It's deteriorated to the point that it can't sustain life anymore. And so she's really sick. We don't know exactly what she was dealing with, but like that, it's gone. And she didn't just get better. She didn't just, I'm back and I'm alive and now I have to recover from whatever I was dealing with. She is 100% well. She is as healthy as she has ever been. And immediately is a word again that Mark uses to show just how these things happen with Jesus. Then he uses the word immediately again to describe the astonishment of the people who witnessed what just happened. He says immediately they were completely astounded. And so time after time we see this. Now in the history of the Jews, who has ever been able to do what Jesus just did? Who's that? Okay, Elijah did. And Elisha. That's right. The only one who has the power to do this has always been God. Now he did it through his prophets, but it was always recognized that it was the power of God through them that raised those from the dead. God's the only one that's ever had the power to do this. And so seeing what Jesus has just done, what they have just witnessed, and they're astonished at what has just happened, to them it should immediately connect a dot of it has to be, if not God himself, it has to be a prophet of God, and directly connected. And their minds go back to Elijah and Elisha and those that they have read the accounts of God doing that. How amazing is that? But this has never happened without God being a part of it. Absolutely. He would have been more familiar with all of those things that have happened than most. So, verse 43 says, "And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and he said that something should be given her to eat." Okay, Jesus again tries to convey the need to keep this one of his most incredible miracles that he's done yet. He's raised somebody from the dead, to keep it under wraps, to keep it quiet. The people in the room would have witnessed the powerful miracle that Jesus just did. But remember what Jesus told the people outside of the room? He's already said to them, why are you doing this? She's just asleep. So when Jesus brings her out, some of those people may have actually thought, oh, she was just asleep. Because Jesus tells them, don't say anything to anybody what you just saw happen. Jesus didn't want them running out into the next room and saying, he just raised her from the dead. In their minds, what are they going to be thinking when she comes out? Oh, he was right. And what we've seen Jesus do so far and all the miracles that he's performed so far, what has that caused to happen? What have we seen? Even one of our key words. What's that? Multitudes, crowd. Every time we see the word crowd, it's one of our key words. There are multitudes of people that are around him. On the way to Jairus' house, what did we see? Jesus trying to press through all the people who were around him because of he's healed a man with a withered hand, and he's healed different illnesses and things like that. What do you think would happen if word got out that Jesus was raising people from the dead? Because who doesn't want someone in their family to be brought back? And so what would that have done? So we've already seen how hard it's becoming for Jesus to just do his regular ministry with the crowds that are already there. And so Jesus is saying, don't tell anybody about what you just saw. And he understands that it would cause more of a problem for what he has a lot of things to accomplish. He has a lot of prophecies to fulfill. He has a lot of things to do that he's been given as a task by his Father while he's here on earth. And so he is doing this to make sure that all of those things can get done. And the very end, this point about, he says they should give her something to eat. Why do you think he says that? What's the point of that? He just brought her back from the dead. I mean, couldn't he have also filled her stomach? I mean, why do you think that's there? Okay. Could be. Okay. You're right. You're right. And we talk about that sometimes with Jesus and his resurrection when he had a meal multiple times with people because of the cultural idea that a spirit will not eat. When we see Jesus eating, when we talk about that sometimes, well, the same thing's probably true here, where Jesus is saying to prove that she is alive, that you're not seeing a ghost, give her something to eat. And so it very well could have been that evidence to help prove to them that she physically is alive right there with them. And so, Yeah, yeah, there was. Right, right. Yeah, could be. So there's multiple things, and that's one of the amazing things that we see with Jesus is whether it's Jewish tradition or it's the law of Moses or whatever it is, he makes sure that everything is dealt with. All of the arguments are covered. And so Jesus is making sure that we see, and it's just a little note that's said at the end of that verse. Give her something to eat, but it has a lot of significance in what it actually means in the text, and that's why we bring it out. Okay, chapter 6. We're not going to get very far, I see, but let's begin here, verse 1. I think I go to chapter 6. Jesus went out from there and came into his hometown, and the disciples followed him. Okay, it says that his disciples follow him. Those are two of our key words, disciple and followed. Who is this referring to? When it says the disciples followed him, who's it referring to? This is one of the things that for so long, I've said this before, in my mind, in the ministry of Jesus, I pictured Jesus and 12 little guys following him around the countryside. And when it said disciples, it was just these 12 guys that are just roaming around from city to city. But that's not what we've seen, is it? We've seen multitudes of people. Jesus is, unless it specifically says in the text that it was just Jesus and his apostles, then every other time that we see the use of disciples, especially in the Gospel of Mark, it's going to be talking about everybody. So the disciples, what proves that they were disciples? What's that? Okay. Those two things. They were following, and the next verse, he was teaching. They were learning. That's definition of disciple. And so, in verse 2, it says, when the Sabbath came, something always happens on the Sabbath, doesn't it? Because they are looking for an opportunity to catch Jesus breaking a Sabbath law. Because if he can break a Sabbath law, then what are the Jews able to do to him? Death penalty. Law of Moses. You break Sabbath law, the problem is the laws that they're enforcing are not God's laws, they're the Jewish traditional laws. So when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many listeners were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? And what is this wisdom given to him, and such miracles as he performed by his hands? And it uses the word astonished here. They were astonished at his teaching. The word that's used here, we've seen several words for amazed or astonished. This one's a little bit different. It's ekplaso is the Greek word. It literally means to be filled with amazement to the point of being overwhelmed and causes them to react. The root word of it means to knock one out of his senses, to knock one unconscious. That's kind of the root word of this Greek word. And so that's the reaction that they have. What they're hearing from Jesus is unlike anything they've ever heard before. And it is the idea that they are stunned by what he's teaching. Have you ever sat and listened to someone preach a lesson, and the way that they draw what's in the text out, you just sit, you go, that's amazing. I've never thought about that before. When I hear teachers and preachers and they bring stuff like that out of the text, and you realize, man, that's exactly what that says, and you're just stunned and blown away by what God is saying in that text. That's what we've never heard anything like this. This is incredible. And so the question that they ask is, where did this man get these things? Where did this wisdom, where did this power come from? Now, is that a good question for them to be asking? Okay, I think it is. I think this is the exact question that Jesus wants them to start asking, because he wants them to see what's going on, what he does, and then he wants them to ask the question, where does this come from? Where is this power from? I think this is exactly what Jesus is trying to get them to do. They're starting to put two and two together. They haven't come up with the answer 4 yet, but they're starting to put 2 and 2 together. And they're realizing that the things that he does, the wisdom that he has, the miracles that they see him performing are something special and unlike anything that's ever happened before. But the next verse actually tells us why they are unwilling, maybe unable, but unwilling to see the true answer to their question. And we're going to stop and we'll look at that next time. But look at it. Read down through the rest of this account here in chapter 6, because they are asking the right question. They've come to the point of asking, where does the power come from? Where does this wisdom come from? That's what we want people to ask. When we're studying the Bible with somebody, we want them to start asking those questions. Where do you get what you're saying? Where do you get the information and the wisdom, the teaching that you're talking about? And if we can't point to Scripture and say it comes from right there, then we've done something wrong. Because it's pointing to God. It's pointing to his power, to his wisdom. And so they're asking the right question. But what happens in the next few verses shows us why they just are not willing to believe in Jesus. And so we'll pick up there and we'll actually talk a little bit about what's going on with Jesus while he's there in his hometown.